Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome from my side to all of you. I'm Ayşe Caglar, a professor at the University of Vienna, Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, and from Monday onwards, a permanent fellow at IWM, so a fresh one. I have the pleasure and the privilege to introduce Ayşe Buğra, a leading political economist, a friend, and a colleague. Ayşe is an emeritus professor at Bogazici University in Istanbul, and until 2017, she was the director of the Center of Social Policy Forum, which she had co-founded together with Caglar in 2004 at Bogazici University. She's an economist by training. Her training was in North America, particularly in Canada, University of Laval and McGill. Though she had held several visiting positions in prominent North American, European universities, Princeton, Harvard, London School of Economics, European University Institute, Florence, Wissenschaftskolleg, Berlin, to name a few, but her career was anchored in Turkey at Bogazici University. And her scholarship is in English, French, but also in Turkish. And I think it is important to emphasize that she writes and publishes in these languages, and a kind of a rarity among the scholars in Turkey. So she has the kind of the reach in all these languages, and definitely a very strong presence in scholarship in Turkey. Though Ayşe is known as a leading scholar of the interrelations between Turkish economy and the state and the political economy of contemporary Turkey, her work covers a broad range of topics. If you look at Ayşe's work, what you see is that from the very first book onward, there is a long-term interest and engagement with Karl Polanyi's work, namely the place of economy and the embeddedness of economy within society. There are two edited books, Reading Karl Polanyi for the 21st Century, Market Economy as a Political Project, and state, market, and organizational form are direct products of this interest and engagement. Here, I would like to also mention that in 1986, Ayşe translated Polanyi's Great Transformations into Turkey, long before that, the kind of the renaissance that Polanyi enjoyed and still enjoys in several of social sciences. Specific formulations of market exchange, state, redistributive processes, reciprocity relations that shape the socioeconomic order and its political implications have been the focus of Ayşe's work and her books that specifically dealt with Turkey. State and Businessmen in Modern Turkey, a comparative study, in 1994, and her much acclaimed 2014 volume book, New Capitalism in Turkey, the relationship between politics, religion, and business. The articulations between class, culture, capitalism, but also religion, and the shifting of power relations in the context of Turkey's insertion into the global economy established the basis of the New Capitalism in Turkey book. I think I could easily say that Ayşe's work went against the grain. Both against the grain of scholarship in Turkey and on Turkey. Her critical reading of the economic and social policies of AKP put the so-called Turkish model and the widely circulated myth about the Anatolian tigers into their place. Rather than approaching this model as a success, supposedly based on the entrepreneurial potential of the emerging conservative businessman of Anatolia, she analyzed how, in fact, politics produced this class within the context of changing regulatory framework. If Polanyi's work is one thread in Buğra's work, her interest in social policy, be it in the context of comparative welfare regimes, be it in gender impact, or in terms of poverty and the changing welfare regimes, is another thread. So what I see is that actually Polanyi as being an undercurrent in her work, but there's another thread in terms of social policy. She approached many of the questions of the contemporary social and political theory and politics, namely the questions of solidarity, difference, redistribution, identity politics, as well as the changing relations between capital and state through the lens of social policies. In a way, I think we see that her work, a focus on social policy, acquired a prominence with an increasing crescendo in, this is what I see in Ayşe's work. And while Polanyi continued to run through as a tone. So I would like to start on that basis by asking why social policies, and how does the undercurrent of your work with Polanyi figure in that? Why the social policies interest and acquired such a prominence in your work, and combining several of the topics and Polanyi? So. I think so.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for the very generous introduction. And let me begin with Polanyi, as I usually do. Whatever work, whatever research I begin with Polanyi. Now, as you said, thank you. That's better. As you said, the most important aspect of Polanyi's contribution is his emphasis on the fact that the economy is not an autonomous domain separated from the society. He insists on the embeddedness of the economy and approaches economy as an instituted process. Now, I will not go into any detail about it. We will not be talking about Polanyi, but this emphasis is important in placing the role, in focusing on the role of institutions in determining the coordinates of the livelihood of people in society. Okay? You have to understand the institutional makeup of the society in order to know how people's livelihood is shaped and how this shaping of people's livelihood affects the terms of participation in society, membership in society. And that's very much related to what social policy is about.
Okay. So oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Social policy deals with these questions about the terms of membership in society.
So you're saying that actually when we're dealing with social policy, we're dealing with membership, and how does social policy determine the meaning of membership in the societies?
And
so this is where that you think that this is the importance of the social policy.
Yes, I mean, yes, and just in parentheses, I also want to say that I find social policy very interesting as an academic, as a field of academic study, because it is very interdisciplinary, and you draw on everything. You trespass all the boundaries, and I like doing that. You draw on history, philosophy, economics, sociology, and you wander around in other people's territories, and you have to do that in order to deal with social policy. And I personally like doing that. But in relation to this membership question, membership in society, that question, I mean, if you look at the questions that social policy deals with, it can be very clear. For example, social policy is about the regulation of employment relations and the way labor market regulation changes the balance of power between employers and employees. This is one set of questions that we find. We also find questions about social security and questions like what kind of social protection an individual has if he or she cannot earn his life by working because of old age, ill health, disability, unemployment, or what happens when the income from work is not sufficient to sustain a standard of life which would be acceptable according to the standards of society, according to the socially given standards of life. Then there are the questions of access to services. What kind of access do we have to health services? What kind of access we have to education or public transportation for that matter? All these questions tell us something about the way we live in society and the terms of coexistence in society. What kind of coexistence we have, what kind of solidarity, social solidarity we have. And of course, when you are asking these questions in social policy, you also ask questions about the institutions. What role does the family or the state or the market or philanthropic organizations play in shaping the livelihood of an individual in society? And these questions are answered in different ways, and you find many different references to the terms in the subtitle of our conversation: rights, needs, equality, difference. These terms do not appear in the same way in different social policy approaches. There are changes, there are differences, and this is important in understanding the kind of political environment that is created by social policy.
But coming back to those variations and differences in those policies, then how do they, in terms of effects, they differ? And how do they, actually I would like to poke on a little bit further on those questions of our conversation. How do they square with the question of needs, difference, equality, and above all, actually justice that I would like to bring in?
All approaches to social policy, all theories, all policies of social policies, policies that deal with the kinds of questions that I mentioned, have a particular understanding of justice. They all talk about social justice. You wouldn't find any approach to social policy without a reference to justice. But the conceptualizations of justice differ. Conceptualizations of justice differ, especially with reference to the relationship between justice and equality.
Okay, equality is fine.
Equality does not figure in all social policy approaches, and rights in the conversation, in the subtitle. Rights, not all approaches are rights-based. So there are those differences.
Okay, but I would like to go further on the question of equality, because in some of them it does not figure, but even if it figures, it's not a straightforward term. And equality of what? Mm-hmm. And so the debates around the relationship between equality and the difference that become important. So I would like you to go in terms of, not only in terms of varying the social policies, whether they talk about equality or not, but even if they're talking about equality, how do they go about equality and in relation to differences?
Well, equality is a term which is surrounded by many tensions. And there are different tensions that we can mention, but the one between equality and difference is a very central one, a very important one, which appears in the social policy. And in there, of course, you also mentioned the meaning of equality. What are we talking about when we are talking about equality? Are we talking about equality of income? Are we talking about equality of opportunity, or equality of outcomes? So it's really not a very straightforward term. But if we continue the way we began, we can talk about parity of participation. A very meaningful way of talking about equality in social policy. Equality in terms of citizenship, equal citizenship. I mean, I know you're an anthropologist, and citizenship is a very contested term nowadays, so I'm scared to use it very much. So I keep saying membership in order to avoid citizenship and avoid entering into all the debates around citizenship. But we can talk about parity of participation as the way we approach equality, we define equality, equal participation in society. And there, of course, the question of difference emerges. Yes. How can we be equal with our different capabilities, motivations, aspirations, needs? Is that compatible with equality? And in social policy, there are two lines of thinking about that. Generally, at a very general level, of course, there are nuances and there are subdivisions, but I think I can depict two lines quite easily whenever I hear about a particular approach to social policy or hear a particular comment about a social policy choice. One reaction to that tension between equality and difference just denies the relevance of equality. Very bluntly put, if we are different, we cannot be equal. This you find, for example, in corporatist Bismarckian models of social policy. There, differences of status at work determine the kind of rights or entitlements people have. So people who are differently situated in working life are not considered to be equal in their social rights. And this is considered to be very normal. The important thing is to have a place in society, and that place does not have to be an equal place. Equal for everyone. It doesn't have to be equal for everyone. Then there's another way of thinking about the tension between equality and difference. And that line of thinking was really introduced mainly by socialist feminists. Socialist feminists asked a very crucial question: how equal we are when we have equal rights? If you don't recognize women's difference and women's different needs, especially associated with childbirth and childcare, can you really assure equal participation of women in society by giving them equal rights on paper? This was a very important observation. This was a very important observation which has led to other observations on other types of difference. What about the disabled and their differences? What about ethnic differences? What about differences of sexual orientation? If if we have a difference-blind attitude in all those cases, can we really develop policies that would assure these people's equal participation in society? And that was very important. There is a quotation from Ruth Lister, which I use a lot, where she says the opposite of equality is inequality, not difference. If you think that it is difference, then you really undermine all the injustices which surround inequalities and really limit the political opportunities, the political choices open to us. So one has to be very clear about the fact that the opposite of equality is inequality. It is not difference. And on the contrary, recognition of difference is a necessary condition for attaining equality or approaching equality. I think that was a very important contribution to social policy.
Okay. Thanks, but as I started, I said that Ayşe had addressed all those questions in social and political theory and politics, but actually did it in social policy. You see that in general, yes, but I would like to come to our also the other part of our title, to Turkey today. And in terms of, I would like to hear a little bit more specifics about Turkey. For example, why I said that your work had, and we see that your work became more and more focused in social policy, but on the other hand, in Turkey also, the questions of social policy became very prominent. And so I would like to ask why in Turkey, that's why now that you're dealing with these questions of social policy, why did they become so important and so central in Turkey? And when we look at the dynamics in Turkey taking place in relation to those, relation to social policies, especially since the early 20s, what kind of a picture we see in relation to what you are referring to? Questions about equality, questions of difference, their balances, and I mean, I don't want to lose the thread of that question of justice also.
Well, we are talking a lot about social policy nowadays in Turkey, much more so than we did, let's say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Not only in Turkey, and this is not only peculiar to Turkey, but to late industrializing countries, as I may use the term, late industrializing countries like Turkey, or developing, emerging markets, as sometimes people say. I don't like it very much, but I mean, these are the terms that we are using. Now, in that part of the world, in those late industrializing countries, social policy was not very much on the agenda, on the political agenda and academic agenda. It has become much more important nowadays, and it might sound like a paradox. It might sound like a paradox because when you think of globalization in relation to the welfare state in countries with mature welfare states, we often tend to think that there is a relationship between economic globalization and the retrenchment of the welfare state, the challenges faced by the welfare state. In late industrializing countries, you see a different trend. In countries like Turkey, and it's not only Turkey, you look at Mexico, you look at Korea, you see similar things. Public social spending has increased. New policies and institutions, instruments were introduced. And this has led, in many cases, to the dismantling of old formal and informal systems of social protection. And this is really not so difficult to understand if you go back to the early capitalist period and the rise of social policy for example, in the 16th century, in the form of social assistance, or in the 19th century, where labor market regulation was discussed a lot. I mean, there is a relationship between the expansion of the market, expansion of market relations, and the interest in social policy. That's what we are seeing in Turkey. But at the same time, we see the dismantling of a former system which was a corporatist one in Turkey. It provided joint health and old age benefits to mainly civil servants and formal security workers. So it was inegalitarian by nature, being corporatist. But at the same time, it was a non-egalitarian one because it excluded a large segment of the population in agriculture or in the informal sector. Now, what happened recently with this new interest in social policy is that a lot of people who previously enjoyed social rights have lost those rights. Civil servants, formal security workers, especially unionized workers. But at the same time, there were different types of benefits provided to the formerly excluded people or to, in general, to the poor in need. So we saw a trend, we saw a development away from the rights of the few to the needs and poverty of a large number of people.
So you're just saying
it's an interesting development, actually.
So you were in a way saying that the landscape of equality and inequality had changed in Turkey, but I do see that. I mean, it is very interesting that how that the landscape changes. But do you see a direction? It's not only a kind of a change. Is it only a kind of a change, or do you see a kind of a development in the direction of more equality? Is the society becoming more equal, and what does that change mean?
Well, in a way, people who were previously out of the realm of social policy are now in the realm of social policy. So that has to be accepted. But at the same time, it's very difficult to say that it is in the direction of equality. It is a change in the direction of equality, because there are rampant inequalities in Turkey, and we know that some of these inequalities are increasing.
Okay.
In the case of class, for example.
Okay. So that you're talking about the inequalities in terms of the class, but are there other kinds of inequalities?
Yeah.
That, I mean, it's inequalities in terms of the class is one thing, but what are the other kinds of inequalities that might be changing? The first thing that occurs to me is in terms of gender inequalities, and gender has been at the very central, at the forefront of many of the debates, and in terms of social policy. So is it only the class inequalities that are changing? Or if the class inequalities are changing, where do we see really in terms of the concretely, how striking they are?
Well, class inequalities are striking. I mean, you see it in statistics. For example, there are some statistics showing the change in the share of labor in national income between 1995 and the mid-2000s, mid-2010s to 2012, 1995, 2012. When you look at the share of labor, you see a decline. And you see that decline in many countries, in many so-called emerging markets. But in Turkey, the decline is really striking. Labor, working people, are getting less of the national income. That is clearly seen. And it's not only in terms of income that you see the inequalities. You see it in working hours, for example. In Turkey, the working hours, the weekly working hours, are among the highest in the world and in the whole world. I'm not only talking about OECD countries, rich countries, Europe, North America, etc., or only emerging markets, all world. I'm talking about the world in general, and the working week is about the longest in Turkey. So this is a sign of inequality. Work accidents, there are very striking and dismal statistics about work accidents that show the state of workplace health and safety conditions. Now, this is about class, but perhaps the most striking aspect of class inequality in Turkey is about gender. Yeah. Is about gender. Women's situation really is not very good in working life, in the economy. Female employment rate, female labor force participation rate in Turkey is one of the lowest in the world. Again, it is extremely low, it's strikingly low. Apart from that, most of the women who work are in the informal sector, not most, about 40%. About 40% of the women who are actually working are in the informal sector. Now, I can go on with gender statistics. Gender inequalities is very important, but I want to come to your observation about the emphasis of gender in social policy. Again, you see an irony there, because social policy debate in Turkey incorporates, extends to the gender question in a very significant way. And that is unprecedented. We didn't have that kind of concern with gender before. Now we do. And it is in spite of that emphasis of gender or women's problems, women's social problems, that we have these inequalities. So what is happening there? This is related to what I said about the conceptualizations of justice in social policy. Women's difference in social policy in Turkey today is recognized. We are not talking about a gender-blind approach to social policy. It is very sensitive to gender differences, but the tension between equality and difference is resolved along the lines of an approach that rejects equality because difference exists. Women cannot be equal because they are different.
But what kind of a picture that you're giving, that I would like to push you a little bit more on that, because at one point these things look like paradoxical in a way that the social policy acquired more dominance, prominence, more people were included into the social policy realm, but the inequalities increased, and also the configuration of the inequalities changed. And then in terms of the class inequalities that you have referred to. In gender, again, that we see that a major kind of a concern in terms of the gender issues, but in terms of the gender inequalities within the social policies, they have changed. And in the terms of maybe the implications might be different, because you said that they are different, but what kind of consequences it has on the women? I mean, you gave that the informal labor, the percentage of informal labor, but there are very specific and a kind of a broad range of gender-specific policies. And I don't want to only reduce it to the in terms of work, but what kind of effects it has on gender inequalities in broad terms.
There are a lot of social policy instruments that target women, that target specifically women. But I think the thing is, they are not really targeting women as individuals. They are targeting the family. Those are policies that aim to maintain traditional gender roles and keep family strong. Keep family strong. This is different from policies that aim at women as an individual, aim at the equality of women as individuals. This is very different. The social policy in Turkey is very familialistic. Familialistic, and it has always been so. I mean, before all these changes, people who were not covered by the formal social security system were relegated to the family in risk situations, when they were old, when they were sick, when they were unemployed, etc. Family took care of them. This is familialism too, but that was familialism too. But now familialism has a different form. It is a form of state-supported familialism. State is very much present. State does not leave the picture and leave everything to the family. It's not the case. State is very much there, supporting the family in order to maintain traditional gender relations within the family and keep the traditional family intact. And of course, this is not conducive to gender equality. Women are seen as care providers, mainly care providers, and they are defined by their motherhood before anything else, but also as care providers to other members of the society, of the family. Even when the policymakers talk about work-family reconciliation, in an attempt to encourage labor force participation of women, they are really thinking about women as care providers first and foremost. So the policies that are supposed to lead to more labor force participation are designed to encourage part-time work, and more significantly, there is no mention of public care, provision of public care. And without taking this very seriously, without taking the importance of public care facilities very seriously, neither work-family reconciliation nor gender equality cannot be realized in a meaningful way. What you do is, what policymakers are doing now, are helping women to cope better as care providers at home. So the roles remain defined in the same old way, and the change is not in the direction of equality, very clearly. And there is more gender inequality, actually, because all these changes occurred in a period of very rapid urbanization. In rural areas, women, of course, worked. They participated in labor, they were part of the agricultural workforce, and now, in the urban setting, they participate in working life less than they did in rural areas, and the confinement in the house has taken a more serious form. more serious.
Okay. Actually, this is when you refer to that, how it reproduces familialism through despite those social policies. Just what occurs to me is that kind of cash transfers for care in the absence of public care. What kind of how does that, in terms of how it reproduces those kind of gender inequalities? But you're giving us a kind of a grim picture in terms of changing, despite of those kind of social policies, despite of those questions of inequality being tackled, that it is inequalities change, but also increase. But I don't want to end with a grim note. Already what is happening there already gives us a kind of enough material to be very pessimistic. But are there any kind of possibilities, changes, different voices in terms of the fragmentations, different kinds of claims that in relation to social policy you see? Because maybe this might be a way that to hang on or to initiate kind of change or imagine a change for a more equal and just society. So is it all inclusive, or is it do you see a kind of a fragmented picture beyond that grim?
There's a very vibrant civil society in Turkey. There are many labor unions, other organizations that articulate the grievances and demands of workers. There are many women's organizations that are very much aware of gender inequalities, and they keep them on the agenda. And I wish I could end here. But this is not the whole picture. The world of unions and the world of NGOs in Turkey is greatly fragmented. Maybe polarized is a better word. There is a lot of fragmentation and polarization in the world of labor and in the world of labor unions and in the world of NGOs working on women's issues. There are labor unions who are very critical of the policies in implementation, and they're asking for change to improve the conditions of workers. But there are also others who are much less critical and much less concerned with questions of equality. The same thing is true with women's organizations. There are many women's organizations, some of which are concerned with inequalities and have equality as an ideal in their agenda, but there are also others who talk about justice, women's organizations who talk about justice without any reference to equality. So this polarization, this fragmentation, I think is very important to keep in mind. And I think in that respect, the case of Turkey is interesting to show that politics of ideas is very important for the kinds of political activities undertaken to deal with problems of identity and politics of recognition in general. So ideas are as important as identities, I think. And if we take that seriously, I can say that there are political positions, there are civil society actors, civil initiatives that take politics of equality seriously, and they struggle to improve the question of class and gender inequality.
Okay, thank you very much, Ayşe. I think that at least we have a kind of a glimpse of a hope. I still have some questions about the tension between needs-based and rights-based policies, and the tension between with the increase of those social policies, also the philanthropy and charity-based logics that in Turkey, which seems to be acquiring a very strong prominence. But I think we should allow the others to come up with questions. If you have questions, thank you very much, Ayşe. Please. No, if there is a question, then we will give.
I could just get the microphone for your question.
Okay. Oh.
If there are questions, of course.
I just wanted to say an observation of me. I'm a student here, and I'm coming from Turkey too. And about the example from the rural areas, I have the observation that the people who come from the rural areas used to say, okay, my wife, she's gonna take care of the house, she's the housekeeper. But now the economic situations led these people to think, oh, this is my observation. That's what I see as a change right now. Like, okay, one salary is not enough for one house, so my wife needs to work at the same time. But I think this is another way of formal, informal inequality, gender inequality that women actually now, who are uneducated, or are becoming uneducated, to go to work in places which make them more actually, which lead them to work in worse circumstances. And at the same time, a lot of students, going to university studying, and at the end they don't have any job. And this is actually another kind of dimension that I have observed in Turkey, that we study, we get some education, but there is actually no job to do. So.
But what is the question?
The question I'm coming to.
Yeah. Okay.
This was just kind of a comment from my side, and the question is what to do. I mean, I think what to do to change. You have mentioned that there are a lot of organizations which are trying to help these problems, but I think the thing is, it's the political settings that we have to concentrate. I mean, I don't know what, this is the question, what to do to change these political settings on this high level.
Okay. Do you want to pick up?
Yes.
Do you want to pick up, or are there other, if there are other questions, maybe we could just collect? Yes.
I'm a master student. Sorry. I'm a master student at King's College London. When social rights and the situation of social rights in Turkey is discussed and examined, of course, one thing, internal situation in Turkey, internal political settings, and I also want to point out the role of multinational corporations and their role in structuring or in the reshaping of social structures and social rights in Turkey. One recent example would be, for instance, protests of floor workers who are mostly female workers who lost their jobs because they wanted to create a trade union. Of course, there are internal and political settings who affect the situations, but on the other hand, Flormar is a multinational company who should or might have a role on the situation. So my question is, what is the internal dynamics? Is there a room for resistance against the effect of this international setting, if you will? Thank you.
International setting, but I don't know what is.
Okay,
I think it is, unless we've touched it. It should be, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for your comments and question. I don't like to bore an audience with statistics, but I take statistics very seriously. And about this rural-urban change, deruralization, urbanization, your kind of sentiment, your kind of belief is very widespread. In the village, women stay home, and when they come to the city, they can participate in the labor force because one income is not sufficient. This is not exactly the case. For example, when you look at female labor force in Turkey, female labor force participation, female employment in Turkey, you see a declining trend, which begins in the 1950s, and continues too long, until the 2000s, even 2010s. This is too long a decline in labor force participation, along with urbanization, because women work in rural areas. Women work in agriculture. There's nothing like a housewife in a rural setting. All people work. In the city, they cannot participate in the labor force. That is the problem. And it is the case, when you look at it historically, this is the case in many countries. This is what you see almost in all countries. Sometimes in the 19th century, sometimes in the early 20th century, but always there's a decline in female employment. It's a U-shaped curve. Urbanization continues, female employment falls, and then it begins to increase. The problem in Turkey is that it has declined for too long. It has reached the lowest point recently, and it is just beginning to rise again. So this is interesting. This is interesting in Turkey. Why has the decline lasted so long? Why has the decline lasted so long? Because there was a combination of factors. First, employment was rare. There were a lot of men who could be employed as cheap labor. So the employers didn't need female workers, actually. If they needed more labor force, more manpower, they would have taken women at low wages. I mean, women are good workers. They are docile. They don't resist as much as men do, usually, etc. So the employers would have preferred them. But since there were a lot of men to hire, they could stick to your convictions about traditional family values, etc. And they were very much in the picture. There was a conservative government in power, hostile to female employment. So the policy choices, combined with the situation of the labor market, has led to a situation which excluded women from the where women was excluded from working life. And then working conditions are so difficult and so nasty in many cases that women are acting rationally when they are trying to avoid participating in the labor force. So what has to be changed? I mean, the question about change, political change, it's not very difficult to conceptualize what needs to be changed. You need daycare. Without good public childcare facilities, emancipation would not come along. That's for sure. And second, labor market, the situation on the labor market, employment conditions, working conditions have to change. They have to change. Where wages are so low, where working hours are so long, when workplace health and safety conditions are so bad, women will try to avoid the labor market as much as they can, and no one can blame them. About resistance, difficult, of course. Difficult. Resistance is very difficult, and it has to do with the question of rights. I mean, civil, political, and social rights are complementary. They complement each other. I mean, where civil rights are not well-founded, are not strongly entrenched, political rights cannot be used easily, and where political rights cannot be used easily, social rights cannot be defended as much as they should be, and where social rights are absent, the exercise of political rights become difficult. So, yes, resistance is difficult. It's not impossible, and it's not absent, but it's not easy.
Okay. Are there any? Yes. Please.
Good afternoon. I'd like to make a last question concerning the year 2015, July 2015. Did that year or did this event have any effect on, let's say, the political strategy concerning women in general in Turkey?
No. I mean, not particularly. It has affected the whole country, but not particularly women.
I'd be interested about the specific and evolving configurations in rural areas. You told us a bit more about the effects of urbanization on women participation in the labor market. But what is actually happening in the rural areas, and has this working role of women there also contributed to a more equal access to participation in society there, or what is happening there with care provision and all these other points that you taught? I'd like to hear.
Yeah.
Is it Shalina? Is it you?
So, I don't know, I think there always has to be kind of a male side to the whole question of female workforce. So, is there any change on role models in Turkey on that case? Because as far as I know, even in a country like Germany, we have very little change in the perceptions of how men should work. Yeah.
I didn't understand the question. I mean, are you talking to housework? Are you talking about housework or division of labor? Can you clarify the question, please? I didn't understand.
So, if I understood you correctly, what we see is that you have this kind of double pressure on females to take care of the family and also kind of join workforce. But logically, you could also claim for men to take more care of the family. but I think I have always this feeling that this is an idea that it's even more slowly developing in societies. So my question is just how it works in Turkey, maybe also compared to Western Europe.
I think we are running, we will be running in time. So although I had the chance to ask several questions, but I will also still add one to connect to all the general topic of the Humanities Festival too, so that however you wish you could pick it up. Because you talked about those kind of the tensions between needs-based and rights-based. I mean, we could get into those kind of very details in Turkey, but I want to come back to the general topic a little bit. Needs-based and then rights-based policy. So we see also a kind of is it a puzzlement? Is it a puzzle that the increasing of those kind of the social policies and the prominence in Turkey, at the same time, simultaneously increasing kind of the charity-based logics and the increase of philanthropy in Turkey, and how do they relate to the questions of power and powerlessness in a way to take it back to the topic. This has been hanging on me, but depending on your time, because of the several questions, you could just pick.
Yeah.
If you wish.
That's an important point, which I should have probably elaborated on. What's happening in the field of social policy in Turkey is that a lot of people, as I said, who did not have any social rights to begin with, are being objects of social policy. They are being addressed by social policy measures. But they are being addressed not as rights-bearing citizens, but as people in need. This one reflection of it is in the number of philanthropic associations, which has increased, really in an impressive way. Recently. Philanthropy, in fact, both in Turkey and elsewhere in the world in general, has become very important. But in a country like Turkey, in the particular case of Turkey, there is this logic of charity which extends to the realm of public policy, public social policy. And you find social assistance, means-tested social assistance measures, which are implemented in a discretionary way. They do not have continuity. They can be in kind rather than in cash. So all these characteristics are characteristics of charity, which do not make an individual an equal rights-bearing citizen. And this observation is important because it also affects the individual as a political person. And it really affects the exercise of political rights. I mean, social assistance, which is discretionary and not rights-based, increases before elections, for example. In Turkey, it's very clear to observe that. And it means that it can be used for the purposes of electoral situation, to contribute to the votes of the ruling party. So this is important, this charity business, because when we are talking about social rights which are different from charity, we are also talking about the impact of charity on not only on social rights but on political and even civil rights. rural areas, I did not mean that women lived very well in rural areas. I just wanted to observe that women in rural areas worked. They were part of the working force, and now their situation was never brilliant, and it is not brilliant today. As for the division of labor in the house, gender division of labor in the family, of course, I mean, when you look at time use statistics, you see that women are doing an overwhelming portion of the care work, and men are not contributing as they should. So, I mean, this is really very clear. Okay, thank you.
I think we have to finish. Thank you very much, Ayşe. Thank you very much.